Get started here. My name is Alex Williams. I'm founder and editor-in-chief of the New Stack, and very happy to be here at CoreOS Fest. This is a wonderful location. Really enjoyed the keynotes this morning, and has me thinking a little bit about our discussion today about this whole idea of what it means to have a healthy open source community. And it seems to be much more relevant now, considering how predominant open source is in everything. I've kind of thought about it as that software now is at the center of business, and open source is increasingly at the center of software. And so if that's the case, then who isn't going to be involved in open source? And if it's going to be that broad, and it's going to be that deep, and kind of something that really is going to be such a part of kind of our careers and really our the way we live and work, then it makes sense then to really start studying open source communities a lot more and understanding them a lot more. And I think there's some things that we could all agree on that, for example, openness and transparency make a lot of sense, right? But what does that really mean? What does that really mean to be open and transparent? What is behind that is required so you can have that healthy and happy community? So those are kind of the things I'm thinking about. But before we get started, I just would like everyone to introduce themselves. And Melissa Smolensky suggested that everyone kind of tell us a little bit how they got, what was the first open source project that they were part of? So, Sue.
Hi, brothers from another mother and sisters from another mister. I'm Sue Choi. I'm Chief Commercial Officer at Dora. You can ask me about that later. The first open source project I was involved in was NASA Nova, which became OpenStack, and the second project was Chef. Does everybody know those two things? Awesome.
What was it like in those early days? Like, what is it you remember about the spirit of OpenStack? Because back at NASA, that was like the real beginning.
It was a lot of talking to NASA lawyers about the Apache license, honestly. They were terrified of it.
Yeah,
absolutely terrified, because they're worried that people would actually use it to send people to space. And if there was a bug in the code, people would be falling from the sky. And so it was a lot of education on that front.
Yeah, interesting.
Hi, I'm Lauren Sell, and I work at the OpenStack Foundation, and actually knew Sue during that very early time, so it's fun to be back together today. In terms of first open source, before OpenStack, I was at Rackspace, and before that I was at a PR agency just doing a lot of startup tech PR, and so had a couple of different companies that were in the open source space, actually in Rails application monitoring, so that's where I kind of got my start, but OpenStack very soon after that.
Hi, my name's... Is this working? Hi, my name is Matthew Garrett. I work at Google. My first significant open source project, I think, was working on Debian, which I started contributing to in various ways about 18 years ago, which feels like a very long time, I guess, because it is a very long time. But since then, I've been involved in a number of open source and free software projects, ranging from the Linux kernel through various OpenStack related technologies, spent some time working at CoreOS on various components there, and just these days mostly focusing on security components and trying to help build systems that users can trust will behave in a way that's considerate of their security, their privacy, and not working for someone else instead.
So why did you get involved in the Debian community? What was it?
At the time, it's what my friends were doing.
Your peers.
Yeah, I was running Debian. There were a number of other Debian developers locally, and so it was the easiest thing for me to get involved with. Just having that fairly low barrier of entry felt like a big difference there.
My first open source community dates me similarly to you. It was MySQL in the early days. And I worked in the community as a database administrator, and I actually found my way to it because I was running a company that did remote database administration as a service and remote databases as a service, and we had people that didn't want to pay for Oracle licenses. And there was this toy database that people thought was, might be interesting, and the Oracle DBAs on staff didn't want to learn it. So I ended up picking it up and playing.
Why didn't they want to learn it?
It was a toy database. It wasn't a real database.
Yeah.
Didn't even have transactions. So MySQL was my first open source community that I spent a lot of time in. So that would have been the early 2000s. And then from there, I did a lot of work with the Nginx community in Nginx, and then now, of course, Kubernetes.
Great. So when you're thinking about open source communities and how you build a healthy one, right? And how you get people involved who may not necessarily be interested in or know a lot about open source, right? What are some of those basics? What are some of the basic principles that you think of that are really important in the foundation of an open source community and its health and prosperity over a long period of time?
Who wants to go first?
I think it's you.
So one of the things about building an open source community is, in fact, you have to look at it in stages, because building an open source community starts with an idea and a bit of code and the potential of this not product but project. But it's one or two people. And then to Matthew's point, it's building a peer group. It's knowing a couple of people that are working on it that might find it interesting. They get you excited about it, and you can then see some sort of vision out of it. So that's a very early stage community, and it's usually very small. Then you might get some adoption, you might have some user base. Now you have sort of more of a two-way street, because they might have different opinions than you do. And so as a community evolves, it really, really changes and goes through a lot of different growth stages. We're seeing one in Kubernetes right now that is, I look at it as sort of the adolescence to adulthood transition, because when I joined Google to work on the Kubernetes community, I was brought in with the explicit goal of taking it from being a company-led project to a community-led project. But just like going through adolescence, you don't just one day say, good luck, here are the car keys, have fun.
Right.
You have to help learn and grow trust, to your point, and grow new leadership and work on a transfer of power at some level. And so we're going through that now. We're going through this, building a new set of governance, a new governance model, in order to better serve the Kubernetes of the future.
Huh. Okay. Well, we'll get back to that.
So I think another aspect of this is how we often think of open source communities as being made up by people who are volunteering to spend their time there, people who are interested in this project, who want to be there strongly, who believe in the project in some way. But inevitably, for any sufficiently successful open source project, you're also going to start seeing people who are there because it's their job to be there, who don't necessarily have the same attachment to the community, who don't necessarily have the same social ties. And one of the key points of growing an open source community is understanding that that's going to happen, and understanding that that's okay.
Okay, so if you understand that's going to happen and that's okay, how do you prepare for it?
One of the important things there is having a strong idea of what the social norms of a community actually are, what the priorities of the community are.
What are the social norms of the community? So what would, like, for example, so how would you define that? So how would you define social norms kind of in this context then?
It's partly things like, who are we developing this for? Who are we caring about most? Who are we prioritizing when thinking about our development? If someone comes in extra from a company being paid to work on this, and is suddenly, we need to start thinking about these enterprise features to the exclusion of what everybody else is working on, that's not going to work. You're going to have either the community will suddenly transition in such a way that the people who were there because they're doing work they're personally interested in doing, they'll vanish. Or you'll have a company comes along, tries to work with this community, feels like they're being pushed out and rejected, and then thinks they've wasted a bunch of money and time, goes away and never comes back. So even at that level of norm, just what are our development focuses? What is the process by which we determine what we're going to be prioritizing? Which kind of users we're going to be thinking about? How we're going to be treating bug reports from different people, that sort of thing. That needs to be something you ideally not necessarily have written down, but at least have a strong concept, a concrete concept around it within the leadership of the community.
So that means then you need to have experience.
I think it is very, very difficult for an open source community to bootstrap itself without either having done it before or without paying a lot of attention to how other communities have grown.
Interesting. Lauren?
Sure. So going back to the original question
Yeah.
of how to get people involved. I mean,
What are the basic foundations? What are the basic foundations of building that open source
Yeah.
organization, the community, so you can actually have, a vital group of people who are feeling engaged and feeling part of something.
Sure. So, I mean, I think that they both said this, but at a basic level, you have to have alignment around a mission. You have to be solving a real problem and getting some kind of, utility out of that, or seeing, and the utility could even be, seeing what you're building in the world making an impact. But at some level, you're not just contributing to, contribute to a project that may not be used. I think that having that real impact is important, or solving that problem. So that was certainly kind of, I think, what happened with OpenStack is that there was just this real vacuum, and there wasn't that software out there. So when we launched the project, we just had a ton of people that came immediately and wanted to get involved and contribute, and it grew really quickly.
That's one of the launches I remember most in my career, kind of covering this space, is the OpenStack launch at OSCON. And I just recall it something so exciting, right? That there was this possibility of a federated cloud, right? And there was this idea that there could be this infrastructure that would be able to be used by anyone, at some point. I think we're still trying to get there, but how did you embody? Was that kind of the core discussions that you were having at the time of the start of the community, and did that help really bring people in and help motivate?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was going out and getting people on board with the mission and making people feel like they could be a part of it, that there was going to be this ecosystem. I think the license that, Sue was talking about earlier with Apache 2 has a lot to do with that, of knowing that, the license is a part of it, also kind of who started the community is a part of that, because it wasn't just, one company that was having a community version of their software and then an enterprise version. It was Rackspace and NASA launching this project that they weren't necessarily planning to create a distribution around or use. It was this different movement that was happening that people were getting on board with. So yes, I think that was a big part of it.
How many maintainers do we have out here of open source projects? Awesome.
All right. Yeah, these are the ones who know.
Yeah. So for me, the health of a community is how you react to negative criticism about the code of your project. And to me, if there's an open dialogue with you and the people that want to contribute in a maybe non-defensive way, sort of sets the tone for your entire community, right? And I don't know, I remember when a lot of these projects were super small, and you're just like, oh, he seems or she seems like a decent human being, right? Because I think a lot of people who contribute, I've been talking to a few of you today, to open source projects don't just contribute to one. You're probably members of several different communities, right? So who here contributes to more than maybe one open source project? Yeah, absolutely. And so you know what feels like a good, healthy community, right? Is just that open dialogue and the acceptance of diverse ideas outside of the core maintainers or even the core contributors of the project for me.
I would love to ask any of the maintainers who'd be willing to raise their hand again. Maintainers, could any one of you talk about what we're saying here? I'd be curious just to get your thoughts on, how do you help people feel like they're comfortable inside these open source communities, for the new ones, because you're the veterans, you're the ones who know it. Who raised their hand again? Who raised their hand? All right, okay, there you go. Can you, John?
Hand you the mic? Yeah, someone's coming.
There's two key things, and one is to be friendly. Obviously, it's to be welcoming and just give the person the impression that whatever feedback they have. You're glad they're giving feedback even if you disagree with the entire contents of the feedback. And that's hard. And I see it fail a lot.
What's hard about it?
Because, like, say if you wrote the code, like, personally, and, like, maybe you spent 3 months arguing about the code, and then somebody shows up who has not been part of your project before, and they're like, okay, well, there's this little thing that you could have done better. The natural reaction to that is not, thank you so much for your feedback. I mean, that is what you need to say, but that's not the first thing that goes through your head. And then the other thing, actually, and I blogged about this recently, it's also very important to respond quickly to newcomers. Because a newcomer into your community is like somebody showing up at a party where they don't know anyone. Yeah. And if nobody talks to them for the first 15 minutes, they're going to leave.
There's that interaction, and for me, onboarding, I feel like Kubernetes has done an amazing job of onboarding new community members with documentation that have been driven by the community instead of Google.
Yeah, I would also say an interesting challenge that we faced and all of these global open source communities has faced is a lot of our growth has been outside of the United States as well, and figuring out how we can make our processes and even like our meeting times and our translations team work to be able to onboard some of these community members around the world, which is extremely important and a really huge area for us. But that's been a big challenge and something to really think about on the open source side.
How about in terms of besides just the personal intercommunication, but the documentation, and how you explain the project and how, you basically kind of provide that presence that speaks to who you are.
As I said, one of the things that made it easiest to get involved with the Debian work that I was doing was the sheer number of people around me who I could ask for information. And that's not a luxury that most people have when entering new communities. There are no convenient people who you bump into on a daily basis who can give you background on things. And so having that written down in some sense is incredibly important. And part of that can be, there's the technical aspects of it. There's why does this code look like this? Why has this been written this way? Why is this feature doing this? But there's also the why does our process look like this? Or even the why does our leadership structure look like this? Why do we make certain decisions in certain ways? Having the sort of cultural background as well as the technical background to the community is as important to make it easy to know how you're supposed to interact with people. Different communities do have very different norms in this respect. In some respects, that's things like, for instance, if I send an email to the Linux kernel mailing list, I should make sure that I CC everybody who's already on the CC list. If I send an email to a Debian mailing list, I should not CC anyone because they're already subscribed to the mailing list, and then they get 2 copies of the mail, and then they get annoyed. But in both cases, I should not send HTML email. And this sort of thing, once you're there, you know all this. It's straightforward and easy. But the first time you're doing this, you will make mistakes. And if none of this is written down anywhere, you will feel like you have no idea how to do the right thing. You will not understand why people keep shouting at you about the layout of your email, completely ignoring whatever you actually said. Communities that document this kind of thing are almost exclusively more functional, not just because the people are willing to. If you have this written down, if people can come and read it, they're going to find an easy job getting in. But the very act of writing it down is also an opportunity to look at your community and say, is this something that actually matters? Or is this a thing that exists because it's just how we've always done things? Is this actually something that's excluding potential contributors? So the act of documenting that, working out what your community norms are, gives you an opportunity to revisit them and perhaps improve them in a way that makes it even more welcoming.
So, Sarah, you've been involved in, what I call one of the years or past 2 years. Well, I don't even know if it's past 2 years, but there's a group of kind of like these mega open source projects that have just kind of boomed, right? and the communities have boomed, right? Kubernetes is in that category. I think it's in multiple top 10 categories on GitHub or something like that. How at some point it becomes an issue about organizational behavior, and you've been experiencing that lately, right? How do you what are the kind of you establish a code of conduct, right? Did you establish it at the very beginning? Was it established from the very start?
The code of conduct was there before I started with the project, so that's more than 18 months ago. It was fairly early on. I'd have to look at the commit date to be sure, but it was very early on. That was one of the things that we felt was just a baseline in order to have good dialogue, because to Matthew's point, how we engage with the community, how we interact is what builds the project, and having something documented, even though we are one of these multiply top 10 projects that is changing all the time and releasing every 3 to 4 months, this means our documentation always lags behind. What worked 6 weeks ago or last release isn't working this time, so it's always changing, which makes it very hard to keep good, solid documentation. But having just as a baseline the code of conduct saying that we expect people to interact in meaningful and respectful ways, we want to encourage diversity, we want to encourage diversity of thought, we want to encourage discussion and openness, transparency, all of these things that we see supported with a code of conduct. We thought that was minimum viable necessity.
So with that minimum viable necessity, you actually had to enforce the code of conduct recently.
We did.
And were you ready for that? I don't know if you ever can be ready for that.
No one is ever ready for that. I think there are lots of things that we have learned from that experience, and all of this is in the 2 public statements we made. Functionally, we need to have more than just a set of norms. We need to have a group whose responsibility it is to make sure that they are clearly established, clearly followed, evolve as necessary, and can be an escalation point for the community, as opposed to a single person or just simply trusting that we will all behave well, because there will be moments when that doesn't happen.
So for the rest of you, Lauren, we were talking a little bit about your code of conduct. What are the principles that you've built into your code of conduct?
Yeah, I would say we are in a similar situation where when we started the foundation in 2012, there absolutely was a code of conduct. It was built into the bylaws, and it's this baseline thing. And when you start out, you go to these events, everyone there. They're all part of the community. It's like we're all good people. And then a couple of years later, there's thousands of people at your events, and you need to have built these systems that scale. So I think one of the most important things we did, and this was probably 2-3 years ago, was draft out a really clear response process for when people made complaints about the code of conduct. And it was very clear about who they should contact and then exactly what would happen along the way, which I think is very important. It encourages people to be able to report things if they feel comfortable knowing exactly what's going to happen in that process and what they're going to expect. They're not going to be scared about reporting it, not knowing which direction it's going to go, who's going to be told. A lot of times they really want discretion, and you want to respect that in certain situations. So being very clear about what that process is has been very important for us. And unfortunately, we have had to enforce the process, as the Kubernetes community has at our events and within our community, and it's been really important to have that.
Sue, in your experiences, what about the other aspects of an open source, community and open source organization that reflect on openness and transparency? I'm thinking, for example, of the licensing that you use, right? You talked about the Apache license, how critical it was. What is it that you're trying to carry through through the rest of the organization, when you're thinking about being a healthy open source community?
Well, one is you want to always attract new contributors, right?
Right.
And so people have thrown out metrics of every conference you should have 30% new people come, and you should always increase your diversity. And I would love that. That means a lot to me. I'm also throwing out the idea for a lot of open source projects when you do have your big conferences, make it free for people who identify with a certain gender or some type of diversity metric. I'm just throwing it out there. Like, why not? I have an open forum. Because, like, why not, right? Because people are like, oh, you should do that for men too. And I'm like, well, I work with, like, a lot of men. And I see them at these conferences and I don't see enough women. Why? And they're like, well, I don't have enough budget. I was like, what if we made it free for you? So, just an idea. Go take that home. Think about it. But for me...
have you done that?
I have not. I have tried to get sponsors to sponsor diversity scholarships, which we have been great at. But people are like, you can have 2 seats. And then you have to make them be in competition with each other. Like, that's awful, right? Like, why do I have to, like, compete with Lauren or Sarah to attend a conference, right? Like, I'm like, oh, I'm going to lose.
It's kind of crazy.
Yeah. So why do we do that? So let's just, anyway. But that is a tangent. Going back to your question, though, I feel like if it's continued, one, you've got to have a good product, have a good project, right? Number one. And then 2, it's actually about growth and about bringing in new voices and seeing where it goes from there, right? I think it's okay to have a very healthy community, and if you've got 40 people, but it's a tight 40 people, and it's a good product, and it's a good project, hats off to you. You got 4,000, you got other problems, which these guys have faced, and if you still have a healthy community and you can hold that together, that is amazing. And we always talk about in open source projects, we always talk a lot about the bad players or the bad happenings, but like if you as a community can take a moment to like congratulate those people who have like worked their butts off with some of these pull requests, for building test harnesses, for building like documentation on the fly, like hats off to those people, and let's spend a lot of time like congratulating the positives in the community and not so much the people with very bad behavior.
So look for those inspirational
Absolutely.
examples.
Yeah, a little pat on the back once in a while. I mean,
Right.
let's give each other some high fives, right?
Right.
That feels
Right.
good.
High five. So Matthew, so I'm curious from your perspective on, how do you coach the people who are part of the community already to be more, to be inclusive to new members?
Yeah, the community leadership needs to be committed to this. If you don't have the people at the top of the community showing a willingness to do the right thing here, it's not going to happen. We've seen there are many large open source communities that are, by many metrics, very successful, that are terrible in terms of diversity and inclusion, that have very high turnover rates of contributors because people spend some time working with this community and then leave because they find the space to be toxic. If the leadership is unwilling to do this, the community probably can't be saved. And so going back to what Sarah mentioned, having the code of conduct there from the beginning, having a good idea of what acceptable behavior is right from the start, makes it much more likely that your leadership will embody that and then carry that through.
So when you say the leadership, like, who are you talking about then?
Do you want me to say Linus?
Sure.
Sure. For instance, the people who are publicly seen as the head of an organization.
Right.
Not necessarily the people who are on organization boards to the same extent.
Right.
People who have leadership positions within an organization are not necessarily perceived as the public face of the organization. But also, I'm conflating things a little here. It's the people who are seen within the organization as being the leaders who are the most important here. And in many cases, that's because of the community bonds you have within the community, there are people at the top who you trust. You assume that they will do the right thing. And if they behave a certain way, you'll end up assuming that within this community, that's the right way to behave. And
okay.
so it's effectively who are the role models. And normally the role models will be the people who started projects, or the people who do the majority of the day-to-day maintenance, or the people who, when faced with adversity, are there talking in a well-thought-through and considered way about what we're going to do about this problem and why, and who are able to sell other people on accepting that as the correct solution. That's a lot of work. And those are the people who you need to be part of your community from the beginning in order to produce a very functioning community that's going to scale well.
So, were you going to say something, Lauren? Go ahead, sure. Yeah.
I was going to agree. I mean, it sounds like what we're talking about is a lot of culture, not necessarily a code of conduct or a policy. And one of the things that
those leaders set the code of conduct and they set the policy. I mean, they influence it.
And
right?
more importantly, the culture, I would say.
Yes.
Yes, which is the behavior around that. It's not just kind of defined by a code of conduct. But I was going to say one thing that I think that we did do well on the OpenStack side, and kind of in the spirit of this panel of contributions outside of code. I think very early on we recognized the value of these different contributions people bring to the community, whether it is documentation, like you were talking about earlier, doing book sprints, creating reference architectures, whether it's hosting events. You know, we had more people attend OpenStack days, which are these kind of local events run by user groups. Last year, I think we had 15,000 people attend OpenStack days around the world than we had at the summits. I mean, when you're able to grow the community and grow people and reward them, like you said, and recognize them, it really takes you a long way. So I think early on in OpenStack, we didn't make it seem like, oh, well, if you're in marketing or if you're in product management, that's like a dirty thing in this OpenStack community or open source community. There's a way to participate that's really valuable.
Sue, any thoughts?
Awesome.
Well, I guess, I mean, it's awesome. There's no doubt. But in terms of your viewpoint, who been the community leaders that you see as been effective role models, and how have they effectively communicated, with people, who were in the senior part of the organization, and then so that can be carried through to the rest of the community?
So a lot of open source projects have governing boards or committees. A lot of times, instead of having it an audio call, they actually do it over IRC, so you can read exactly what happened and what was passed. And those same people are on the board that are active in the channels too. That's a thing, and I feel like the influence that they bring as not just a board member or part of a governing committee and whatever they choose. It's really interesting, right? There's so many different types of committees, and I think you're right about documenting. I don't think a lot of people know what to expect, but you've got to uphold what you preach while you are in your own channel, right? And hopefully there are guidelines that even if you are a maintainer or if you're part of this leadership and you do cross the line in somewhat, that someone can call you out on it.
So is anyone in the audience willing to stand up and say what is an example of a great community leader that they've seen in an open source community? Someone? No? I guess there aren't any, huh?
Wait a minute.
There you go, Sarah.
How about I suggest that we have lots of very different, very committed community leaders across open source that bring very different and very human skills to these.
Right.
So choosing one is incredibly hard. You can speak about people who have written books or people who have had high profile positive experiences, high profile negative experiences, and it's really the work of leadership shouldn't be about the names. The work of leadership is about making the community successful.
So in that context then, there have been open source organizations that have been traditionally been led by one person, right? Usually a man, right? How is this changing, and how must it change so we can have that diversity of inclusiveness? Because if we don't, then all the maintainers will always be the same, right? And then you have the danger of a monoculture, and what's the point of an open source community anyway if you have a monoculture?
Anybody want to tackle that first?
Well, I was just going to say I'm sitting with two women that I think are great leaders and have made big waves in open source and infrastructure and other areas. So, and both prominent. So that's great to see. And in OpenStack specifically, it's a little bit of a different model that the technical committee is fully elected by the contributors to the project. And the same thing, we've actually moved to this model for the user committee as well, which is kind of unique, I think, in open source. So we've defined criteria for what we call an active user contributor, which is not the best name, but it's an AUC. So they basically have a constituency that now votes on the user committee. And I think that, you know, I mean, that kind of democracy does, the leadership does evolve over time, but at the same time,
Gets messy.
yes, democracy is messy. We were talking
Yes,
about this
yeah.
earlier. So everything is out there. It is fully transparent. But I do think that the elected leadership has been a really important part of the project and as we've grown over time.
So since Kubernetes is actually going through a Bootstrap governance process right now, what, as I said, worked 6 months or 2 releases ago isn't working now in a meaningful way. And we need to look at very intentionally how to govern this, because we as a community said BDFL is not the way to go. We don't want to do that. So I think what we're seeing is an evolution of open source from more established, longer standing projects that did have more of a BDFL model to projects that maybe look more like some of the projects out of the Apache Foundation, which have more of a committee at the top of them, to the evolution that continues through OpenStack, which has a lot of companies coming to it, trying to guide many different component pieces. So we're seeing the governance of open source projects change and evolve to meet the needs of the project. And I think needs of the project include a better sense that diversity and inclusion is important. And so I think we're seeing that model change over time.
How, and this is my last question, I know we gotta get going, but how must, you know, one of the things I think about is like, how do people feel accepted? How do they feel welcome, right? And you can see that in all kinds of ways. It's like how you enter a building, how, you know, what's it like walking down a street? You know, there's all these different ways to experience, you know, something that you feel comfortable with. We talked about, like, for instance, you know, the benevolent dictators for life, right? You know, how that seems to be, that doesn't seem to be very as relevant now as it may have like 20 years ago. But how about the interfaces that we have that are used for open source projects, right? The you know, which are very much haven't changed, you know, in quite a long time. How are those impacting the way that we think about inclusiveness and you know, and these issues that you're speaking of?
So I'll speak to how Kubernetes looks at this, or how I look at this within Kubernetes is probably a better way to say that. The same way people learn different ways, people interact and communicate and feel welcomed in different ways. So we have video chats, we have chat channels, we have email, we have offline one-on-one communications, we have recorded videos for people that are off time cycles. So we try to give as many possible methods of communication and welcoming, and make people feel heard, feel that they have a way to contribute, have a way to have a voice, and then feel accepted and responded well to. So the people know that they are actually party to this, even if we didn't use their feedback to change our decisions.
Matt, I'd like to give everyone just the last chance to chat. Matthew, you have anything you'd like to add to that?
Not really.
Okay. That's all right. Sue? You're good? All right. Well, excellent. Well, thank you all for participating in the panel, and thank you all for coming. Appreciate it.